The smell hit Nathan Briggs before anything else did. Rust and old diesel and something underneath both of those things. Something that did not have a name, but that he recognized the way a man recognizes the voice of someone he has not heard in a long time. He stood in the doorway of the equipment shed with the November wind pushing at his back, and he looked at what his grandfather had left behind. Not the land, not the debt, not the 400 acres of black Iowa soil that had been in the Briggs family since 1961. Those things were still there, still real, still waiting. What Nathan was looking at was a 1974 Massey Ferguson 275 sitting in the back corner of a collapsing shed, half buried under 20 years of dust and bird droppings, and the slow, patient work of decay. The tires had cracked down to the cords. The hood had rusted through in 3 places, actual holes where weather had eaten the metal down to nothing. The exhaust stack leaned sideways at an angle that made no mechanical sense. One rear wheel had sunk 3 inches into the packed earth floor, as if the ground itself had decided to swallow the machine one slow year at a time. Nathan put his hand on the fender and felt the roughness of deep rust under his palm, and flakes of what had once been red paint came off on his fingers like dried blood. His grandfather, Walter, had bought this tractor in the spring of 1974, with money he did not have, signing a note at First Harlan Agricultural Bank with hands that were still shaking from the risk of it. He had driven it off the lot at Patterson Equipment in Harlan and taken it straight to the south field without going home first, without eating lunch, without telling his wife Margaret where he was going. He had turned 2 acres before sundown that first day. He had come home with dirt on his boots, and something in his eyes that Margaret would later describe as the look of a man who has just made peace with a decision he cannot take back. That tractor had built everything. Every fence post on the Briggs farm had been driven with that machine pulling the auger. Every acre of the original 60 that Walter had started with had been turned by that plow. The farm had grown from 60 acres to 400 over the course of 30 years, and the Massey Ferguson had been part of every expansion, every hard season, every year when the rain came wrong, or the prices fell, and Walter Briggs worked longer hours for less money, and did not once complain about either. Then, in November of 1992, Walter had parked it in this shed and closed the door, and the door had not opened again until 3 days after his funeral. Nathan was 28 years old. He had grown up on this farm, left for 2 years to take diesel mechanic training at Iowa Western Community College, and come back because the farm needed him, and because he had never seriously considered doing anything else. He was not a large man, but he was built the way men who work with their hands are built, compact and deliberate, with forearms that showed the work in them, and a way of moving that did not waste anything. He had his grandfather's eyes, gray and steady and slow to give away what was happening behind them. He stood in that doorway for a long time without moving. Then he drove to the equipment auction in Harlan on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November, 3 weeks after Walter Briggs had died in his sleep at the age of 84. And that was where things began to change. The auction lot at Shelby County Equipment Liquidators sat on the east side of town behind the co-op. It was the kind of place that smelled like cold metal and hydraulic fluid, and the particular sadness of machines that have outlived their usefulness to someone. Rows of equipment stretched across the gravel yard, tractors and combines and tillage tools, and an assortment of smaller machinery that nobody had gotten around to throwing away. A crowd of maybe 60 men moved between the rows, farmers in canvas coats, equipment dealers in newer trucks than the farmers drove, 2 men in clean boots who were not from Shelby County, and whose presence Nathan noted and filed away without appearing to notice them at all. One of those men was Gideon Hargrove. Nathan knew who Hargrove was. Everyone in the county did by now. He was 45 years old and worked as Director of Land Acquisition for Vanguard Agro Corporation, a company headquartered in Des Moines that had spent the past 18 months buying farmland across 6 counties in western Iowa, not farming it, buying it, consolidating it. Hargrove drove a black Escalade and wore a charcoal wool coat that had never been near a grain elevator. And he had the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He had come to Walter Briggs's door 6 weeks before Walter died. Nathan had been in the machine shed when the Escalade pulled up the gravel drive, and he had watched from the doorway as Hargrove walked to the porch in his Italian leather shoes, picking his way around the mud with a kind of fastidious irritation. He had watched his grandfather open the screen door and stand there in his overalls and his worn flannel shirt, 83 years old and straight as a fence post, while Hargrove made his pitch. The offer had been $1.2 million, cash, for 400 acres of Briggs farmland, the equipment, the outbuildings, and the water rights. Walter had listened without speaking. He had stood there on his own porch in his own doorway and let the man finish. Then, he had said with no particular heat and no particular hurry that Hargrove could get back in his truck and drive back to wherever he came from, and that, if he came back again, he would be trespassing. Then Walter had gone inside and closed the door. Not hard, just closed it, the way you close a door when the conversation is finished. Hargrove had stood on the porch for a moment with his mouth slightly open. Then he had walked back to the Escalade and driven away. Nathan had watched the whole thing from the machine shed and had not said a word either. And afterward he and his grandfather had eaten supper together and talked about the weather, and neither of them had mentioned Hargrove at all. That had been 6 weeks before Walter died. Now, Hargrove was at the equipment auction standing near the back of the lot with a man Nathan did not know. A younger man with a briefcase who was almost certainly a lawyer. And they were talking quietly and looking at things on a phone, and not really watching the auction at all. They were watching the people at the auction. They were making notes. Nathan moved through the rows without stopping until he found what he was looking for. It was in the back corner of the lot, separated from the other equipment by several empty feet of gravel, as if the surrounding machinery had instinctively moved away from it. A 1974 Massey Ferguson 275. Not the same machine as his grandfather's, but the same model, same year, same configuration. It was in worse shape. Both rear tires were flat. The hood had been pried open at some point and not fully closed again, and the gap let you see the engine block, which was covered in the kind of corrosion that accumulated over decades of neglect. The seat had been replaced with a piece of plywood. Someone had spray-painted a number on the side in orange paint. Nathan crouched down beside it and looked at the front axle. He checked the wheel hubs. He put his hand under the frame and felt along the crossmember. He stood up and looked at the engine through the gap in the hood, checking things that were not obvious to someone who did not know what they were looking at. The auctioneer reached lot 47, the Massey Ferguson 275. He described it in the same tone he used for everything else, a practiced recitation of the facts with no particular enthusiasm attached to them. What it was, what year, what condition. The condition category he used was fair, which in equipment auction language means something between rough and parts only. Nobody moved. The auctioneer opened at $300. The crowd stayed still. He dropped to $200. A man near the front shook his head. Someone near Nathan made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was aimed in the same direction. Nathan raised his hand. The auctioneer looked at him. $800, Nathan said. Not as a bid, as a statement. The auctioneer blinked, recalibrated, said $800 from the man in the back, and looked around the lot for another bid that didn't come. He said, going once and going twice with the particular theatrical patience of a man who already knows how this ends. Then he said, "Sold." The sound that moved through the crowd was not loud. It was the specific sound of 60 people having the same thought. At the same moment, a murmur that contained something close to pity, and something close to amusement, and something that was neither. A man Nathan knew from the feed store. Tommy Hale turned around and looked at him with an expression that said everything without saying anything. Hargrove had not moved from his spot near the back, but Nathan felt the man's attention shift the way you can feel a change in air pressure before a weather front arrives. Hargrove turned and said something to the man with the briefcase. The man with the briefcase wrote something down. Then Hargrove looked directly at Nathan for the first time and said loudly enough to carry that some people would rather buy a headstone than a future. The men around Hargrove found this funny. Nathan signed the paperwork and wrote a check from an account that now contained $2,400, which was the total of his liquid assets, and loaded the Massey Ferguson onto his trailer, with the help of 2 men from the auction company who did not speak while they worked and drove home. His brother Cole called before Nathan had reached the county road. Cole Briggs was 25 years old and lived in Chicago, where he worked as a financial analyst for a firm whose name Nathan could never remember. Cole had driven up for the funeral and stayed 3 days, and had spent most of those 3 days on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a yellow legal pad covered in numbers that he kept showing to Nathan as if the numbers would eventually say something Nathan had not yet understood. He drove a silver BMW that he had leased because, as he had explained with complete seriousness, leasing made more financial sense than buying given his expected income trajectory over the next 5 years. Nathan Cole said without any preliminary, "I heard what you did. Word travels fast," Nathan said. "What is wrong with you?" Cole's voice had the quality it always had when he was trying to control something he was not fully controlling. "We are looking at losing this farm. Not maybe losing it. Actually losing it. Vanguard bought the note from First Harlan 3 weeks ago. We have 90 days from the date of the notice to either pay the full amount or negotiate a sale. $112,000. We do not have $112,000. You know this." "I know it," Nathan said. "So you spent $800 on a piece of junk that hasn't run since the 90s. It ran until 92, Nathan said. There was a silence on the line that Nathan recognized. It was the silence Cole used when he was deciding whether to be patient or whether to stop being patient. Nathan Cole said with great deliberateness, "That is not the point. The point is that Vanguard sent a notice of acceleration 2 weeks ago. It was delivered to the estate. I have a copy. They purchased the outstanding balance of $112,000 from First Harlan Agricultural Bank, which means they are now the creditor, which means they have the legal right to initiate foreclosure proceedings if the debt is not resolved within 90 days of the notice date. That is the situation. That is what is happening. And while that is happening, you are at an auction buying a broken tractor." Nathan pulled into the farm drive and stopped the truck. He sat there for a moment with the trailer behind him and the shed visible in the side mirror. "I'm gonna fix it," he said. The silence this time was different. "Fix it," Cole said. "Yes." "Nathan, listen to what you're saying. You want to spend time that we do not have fixing a tractor that does not run on a farm that we are about to lose." "It's Grandpa's model," Nathan said. "Same year, same configuration. I know this engine. That is not a financial argument. I know that too." Cole exhaled slowly. He said he was going to send Nathan the contact information for an agricultural debt negotiator in Des Moines who had handled situations like this before. He said that Vanguard's initial offer of $1.2 million was almost certainly negotiable upward. given the water table data he had seen on the property, which suggested the land was worth more than the offer implied. He said that Nathan needed to think practically and not emotionally, and that the tractor was a symbol of something Nathan was feeling, which he understood. But that symbols did not stop foreclosures. Nathan said he understood. He thanked Cole for calling. He drove the truck and trailer around to the shed and unloaded the Massey Ferguson by himself in the gray afternoon light. And when it was done, he stood in the doorway of the shed with both machines in front of him. The rusted one he had just bought, and the ruined one his grandfather had parked in 1992, and he looked at them for a long time. Then he went inside and made supper, and ate alone at the kitchen table where his grandfather had eaten breakfast every morning for 50 years. That night, after he had done the feeding and checked the fence line on the south pasture and run through the numbers one more time until his eyes blurred, Nathan walked out to the shed with a trouble light and a 5-gallon bucket of tools. The shed groaned when he pushed the door wider. One of the roof beams had cracked years ago, and the whole structure leaned to the east at an angle that was not dangerous but was not reassuring either. He made a note to shore it up before the serious work began. The last thing he needed was the roof coming down on him and the tractor both. He started on the outside. Wire brush and scraper and penetrating oil on every bolt he could reach. The rust on both machines was deep, not surface rust, but the kind that works its way into the grain of the metal and turns solid steel into something that crumbles between your fingers. He worked by the yellow light of the trouble lamp, while moths circled above him, and the sounds of the November fields pressed in through the open door. Wind moving through the dry corn stalks that still stood in the east field. The distant sound of a truck on the county road. The particular silence of open land at night that is not silence at all, but is simply the absence of the sounds men make. He did not try to open the hood that first night. He just cleaned. He pulled handfuls of old straw and mouse nests from every cavity he could reach on both machines. He scraped 2 decades of grime from fenders and wheel hubs and drawbar ends. When he stopped, it was past midnight, and his hands were black with rust and grease, and he had made almost no visible progress, but he had started. And starting was the thing. The next 2 weeks followed a pattern that did not vary. Days running the farm, which in November meant maintenance and planning and the endless paperwork that modern agriculture required, and nights in the shed. He got the hood open on the 4th night after applying penetrating oil for 3 consecutive days to the hinge bolts which had fused into solid masses. When the hood finally swung up, he stood there looking at the Perkins diesel and felt his stomach drop in the specific way it drops when you see something that is going to be harder than you hoped. The engine was seized. He had known that. But knowing it and seeing it are different things. The cylinder head showed coolant residue caked around the gasket surface in mineral deposits that had built up over years of a slow leak. The injector lines were cracked. The fuel filter housing had rusted through. The alternator was frozen solid. The water pump had been leaking for years before the tractor was parked. You could tell from the stain pattern on the block. He took a breath. He took another one. Then he started taking it apart. Cole came back on a Saturday in the 2nd week of December. He drove up from Chicago in the BMW with a laptop bag and an expandable folder of documents, and the expression of a man who has decided to try one more time. He found Nathan in the shed at 10 in the morning, lying on a creeper under the Massey Ferguson with a ratchet and an extension bar. Nathan rolled out from under the machine. He was wearing the same flannel shirt he had been wearing 3 days running, and he had not shaved, and there was a cut on his left hand from a slipped wrench that had not fully healed yet. Cole stood in the doorway in his coat and his clean boots and looked at the shed. Both machines were in various stages of being taken apart. Parts sat in labeled bags on the shelves. Coffee cans held sorted bolts. A composition notebook that Nathan used for notes sat open on the workbench next to a grease-smeared copy of a Massey Ferguson service manual he had ordered from a dealer in Nebraska. Nathan Cole said. Cole. Nathan said. I drove 4 hours, I know. Thank you. Cole looked around the shed again. The smell of penetrating oil and old grease was strong. He said, Can we go inside and talk? They went inside and Nathan made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table and Cole opened the expandable folder. He had done a great deal of work. There were comparable land sales going back 3 years, a water rights assessment that a firm in Des Moines had done on similar properties in the county, a projection of Vanguard's acquisition pattern that suggested the company would continue buying in this area for at least another 2 years. He had spoken to the agricultural debt negotiator. He had also spoken to a real estate attorney. The picture, Cole said, was this. Vanguard had paid approximately 90 cents on the dollar for the note from First Harlan, meaning they had paid roughly $100,000 to acquire a debt of $112,000. Their strategy was standard for this type of acquisition. They would apply maximum legal pressure, allow no extension, and wait for the estate to fail to perform within the 90-day window, at which point they could initiate foreclosure and acquire the property for a fraction of its market value. The market value of 400 acres in Shelby County with good water table access was currently between $2 and $2.4 million. They had offered 1.2. They would ultimately accept somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 if negotiations were handled correctly. Nathan listened to all of this without speaking. When Cole finished, Nathan said, Who owns the water rights? Cole looked up from the folder. What? The water rights. Grandpa always said the water under this land was separate from the land title. He said he had a document for it, separate from the deed. Cole looked back at his papers. He said the real estate attorney had reviewed the title documents that were on file at the county recorder's office and had not noted anything unusual. Nathan said, There might be something that's not at the county recorder's office. Cole stared at him. Nathan, he said in the tone of a man who is very tired, Can you please focus on the actual situation? I am focused, Nathan said. I just need to find something first. Cole left the next morning. He left the expandable folder on the kitchen table with a note on top that said the debt negotiator's number was on the yellow sticky on the inside cover, and that he hoped Nathan would call before it was too late. Nathan read the note and put it on the counter and went back to the shed. He had been thinking about something his grandfather had written in the repair log. He had found the log, the one Walter had kept for the machines in the drawer, under the workbench. Not the Massey Ferguson's notebook, but a general farm repair log in a different cover. In an entry dated November of 1991, Walter had written about a problem with the hydraulic system on the Massey Ferguson, and had noted that he had consulted Gus before making the repair. Just Gus, no last name, no town, no further explanation. The name appeared again in an entry from 1988, and again from 1983. Each time just Gus, with the certainty of a man writing about someone he did not need to identify, because he could not imagine a reader who would not know who he meant. Nathan had found an old address book in the desk in the front room, the kind with alphabetical tabs. The leather cover worn soft with handling. Under the letter M between Massey Ferguson Parts and Mitchell Hardware, there was an entry in his grandfather's handwriting, Mercer G., and an address in Davenport, and a phone number with an old area code. He had not called yet. He was not ready to call yet. There was something he needed to find first, something that he believed was in the machine, and until he found it or confirmed it did not exist. He did not want to explain to anyone what he was looking for or why. On the 41st night, working by the trouble light while the wind outside had turned genuinely cold, Nathan was putting the ancillary components back onto the engine. He had freed the pistons. He had pulled the head and driven it to a machine shop in Atlantic, a 40-minute drive, where a machinist named Rudy had turned it over in his hands and whistled softly and said he had not seen a Perkins a D 4.2, 3.6 in years, and that whoever had owned this engine had known what they were doing. Nathan had gotten it back with new valve seats and a resurfaced deck and a remark from Rudy that the engine would outlast the tractor if he put it back together right. He needed a wrench, a 9/16 which he knew his grandfather kept in the toolbox mounted under the seat of the original Massey Ferguson, the one that had been in the shed since 1992. He had been ignoring that machine's internal storage because it was not part of the work he was doing. But he needed that wrench, and it was faster to get it from there than to find another one. The toolbox was bolted to the frame with 2 carriage bolts that had rusted into something approaching mineral deposits. Nathan worked them free with penetrating oil and a breaker bar and significant patience. The lid resisted and then gave all at once with a sound like a small exhale. Inside, the tools were arranged exactly as Walter had left them 27 years earlier. Wrenches sorted by size and laid in a row, a tin of cotter pins, a tube of never-opened gasket sealant, a magnetic parts tray with 3 bolts stuck to it, waiting for a job that had never come. And underneath the tools, set in the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of black oilcloth and held with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity and lay in loops around the package. Without gripping anything was a composition notebook, the same kind Nathan had seen his grandfather use for everything. Black and white marbled cover, swollen with years of use, the cover stained with oil, and something that might have been coffee. In the upper right corner, written in Walter Briggs's careful block letters, the handwriting of a man who had gone to school when penmanship was taught as a serious subject. Repair Journal, W. Briggs, 1974 to 1992. Nathan stood in the shed for a moment without moving. Then he sat down on the dirt floor with his back against the wheel of the machine and opened the notebook. The first entry was dated March 1974. Brought the Ferguson home today, Walter had written. Drove it off Patterson's lot and went straight to the south field. Turned 2 acres before supper. Machine runs like a top. Paid more than I should have, but I believe it will earn its keep. Nathan turned pages slowly. The journal was a complete record of 18 years. Every oil change, every valve adjustment, every repair, every part sourced from every supplier prices noted, with the care of a man who knew exactly what everything cost, because the margin between what things cost and what he could afford was never as large as he would have liked. There were hand-drawn diagrams of the hydraulic circuit. There were notes about tire pressure and ballast weight for specific field conditions. There was a list of parts suppliers with phone numbers, some crossed out as businesses closed and replaced with new numbers in different ink. Gus Mercer appeared in an entry from June of 1976. Nathan sat up straighter when he read it. Took the water rights paperwork to Gus today, Walter had written. Asked him to make something permanent for it. He used a piece of steel pipe from his scrap pile, sealed both ends with the torch. Good tight seal. Gus asked what was in it. I told him it was insurance documents. He didn't ask again. Mounted the cylinder behind the toolbox under the secondary seat bracket. Only place on this machine that doesn't get touched in regular maintenance. Margaret says I'm being dramatic. I told her I'm being careful. There's a difference. Nathan closed the journal and set it on his knee. He was very still. He looked at the machine in front of him. The original Massey Ferguson 275, the one his grandfather had parked in 1992. He looked at it with different eyes than he had been looking at it with for the past 6 weeks. Not as a relic, not as a restoration project, as a vault. He picked up the trouble light and moved it closer, and looked along the underside of the frame behind the toolbox location in the area below and behind the secondary seat bracket. There was grime and packed dirt and 45 years of accumulated grease and dust. And there was something else. A cylinder of dark metal, maybe 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, mounted with 2 small U-bolts that had been painted over and repainted until they were barely distinguishable from the frame itself. Nathan did not move for a long time. Then he got up and found a wrench and started working on the U-bolts carefully. The way you work on something you are not sure you have the right to touch. The bolts came loose in their own time. He caught the cylinder in both hands when it came free. It was heavier than he expected. Both ends had been welded shut by someone who knew what they were doing with a torch. He carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light, turned it over in his hands. Then he got the angle grinder from the shed and cut through one of the welds, slowly, not rushing it. And when the end cap came free, and he tilted the cylinder, what slid out into his palm was a rolled piece of paper in a sleeve of clear plastic, sheeting the kind that came in rolls from the hardware store, sealed with electrical tape on both ends. He peeled the tape back carefully, unrolled the plastic. Inside was a document on heavy cream-colored paper, still crisp, preserved by the seal in the dark and the decades of Iowa weather. It had been insulated from by 2 inches of welded steel pipe. At the top of the document, in the letterhead of the State of Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, it said, Certificate of Water Rights, Shelby County, Iowa. Certificate number 7. Issued the 14th day of April, 1976. Nathan read it once. Then he read it again. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and held it in both hands under the kitchen light, and read it a third time, making sure he understood what it said. It said that Walter James Briggs and his heirs and assigns in perpetuity held priority water rights to the aquifer underlying the property described in Shelby County Deed Record 4712. It said that these rights were not transferable as part of any deed instrument or foreclosure proceeding, and could not be alienated from the property title without the written consent of the State of Iowa Department of Agriculture. It said that any extraction of water from the specified aquifer by any party other than the certificate holder was subject to trespass and compensatory damages under Iowa Code Chapter 4, 6-2A. In the lower right corner, 2 signatures, Walter Briggs, and beneath it as witness Gerald Mercer, Davenport, Iowa. Nathan set the document down on the table. Outside, the wind was moving across the fields in the dark. The corn stalks rustled in the east field with a sound like dry paper. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled like coffee and old wood. He thought about his grandfather standing at Gus Mercer's shop in June of 1976, 43 years old, handing a rolled document to a welder he trusted completely, watching it disappear into a sealed steel pipe, and then driving home and mounting it under the secondary seat bracket of a Massey Ferguson 275. Because he had decided that a machine he intended to work for the rest of his life was the safest place he could think of to put the most important piece of paper he owned. He thought about the last entry in the repair journal, November 14, 1992. Engine making noise on number 3 cylinder. Head gasket showing signs. Could fix it, but the new case is here now. Parking her in the back shed. And then beneath the mechanical notes in handwriting that was slightly shakier than the earlier entries, but still clear and still deliberate. If one of my grandchildren ever reads this, I want them to know something. Don't give up on this land. It will test you. But it is worth fighting for. If you are reading this in the shed, you are probably the right one. Nathan sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The document was in front of him. The repair journal was in his coat pocket. Outside, the farm was dark and cold and entirely his, or had been, or would be again. He did not sleep that night either. But this time it was not grief keeping him awake. He put the certificate back in the plastic sleeve that night. He rolled it carefully the way his grandfather had rolled it and slid it into the steel cylinder and set the cylinder on the kitchen counter where he could see it from the table. He did not call anyone. He did not send any messages. He sat with the repair journal open in front of him and read it from the beginning again. Slower this time, not for the mechanical information, but for the voice behind it. The particular way Walter Briggs had of stating things plainly, without explaining himself the way a man writes when he is writing for himself and not for an audience. He fell asleep at this table sometime before dawn, with his cheek on his forearm, and the journal still open in front of him. And when he woke, the kitchen was gray with early light, and the certificate cylinder was still on the counter, and the farm outside was still there, all 400 acres of it still waiting. He had 62 days left. The week after he found the certificate, Nathan called the number in his grandfather's address book. The phone rang 4 times, and he was preparing himself for a disconnected line or an answering machine from a business that no longer existed, when a man picked up and said, "Mercer Welding, what do you need?" The voice was old, but direct. The voice of a man who did not see the point of telephone pleasantries. "My name is Nathan Briggs," Nathan said. "Walter Briggs was my grandfather. I found your name in his address book and in his repair journal. I think you did some work for him in 1976. There was a silence on the line that Nathan could not read. Then Gus Mercer said, "How is Walter?" Nathan told him. Another silence. Longer this time. "He was a good man," Gus said. There was nothing performative in the way he said it. He said it the way you state a fact about weather or soil. He was a good man, and that is the truth of it, and everything else is secondary. Nathan said, "I found the machine, the Massey Ferguson, and I found what he put inside it." The line was quiet for long enough that Nathan thought he had lost the connection. Then Gus said, "You'd better come to Davenport." Nathan drove to Davenport on a Thursday morning with the steel cylinder on the seat beside him and the repair journal in his coat pocket. The drive was 3 hours through the flat winter landscape of western Iowa fields, stripped to stubble sky the color of old pewter, the land showing its bones the way it only did in November and December, when the crops were gone, and there was nothing left between you and the horizon. He stopped once for gas and coffee and stood outside the truck in the cold for a minute just to feel the air, which smelled like diesel and frozen earth and the particular clean emptiness of a Midwest winter morning. Mercer Welding occupied a steel building on the industrial east side of Davenport, set back from the road behind a yard that contained an organized collection of metal stock and salvage. The building was old but maintained. The sign above the door was hand-painted and had been repainted several times, each layer showing through at the edges. Nathan pulled into the lot and sat for a moment before going in. Gus Mercer was 71 years old and built like something that had been weathered rather than aged. His hands were the kind of hands Nathan had only seen on men who had spent their entire lives working with metal. They looked less like hands than like tools that happened to be attached to a person. He was wearing a leather apron over a canvas shirt, and he did not offer to shake hands when Nathan came in because his hands were dirty, and he was in the middle of something that he finished before he stopped and turned around. He looked at Nathan for a moment. Then he said, "You look like him." The eyes. Nathan set the cylinder on the workbench. Gus looked at it for a long time without touching it. "I sealed that," he said. "June of '76. Walter brought it in a paper tube rolled up, said he needed it preserved. I asked him what it was. He said, insurance. I asked what kind of insurance. He said the kind that might not be needed for 20 years or might not be needed for 50, but that he wanted it there when it was needed regardless. He picked up the cylinder and turned it over in his hands. Nathan had cut one end to get the document out. Gus looked at the cut. Clean work, he said. Nathan said, my name is on the certificate. My grandfather made me the heir on the water rights separately from the land deed. But I need to understand what it means legally before I do anything with it. Gus set the cylinder down. He said, I know a man. He handled agricultural water disputes in this state for 30 years before he retired. He still takes cases when something interests him. He is not cheap, but he is the best there is at this particular thing. He wrote a name on a piece of paper and handed it to Nathan. Then he said, sit down. I'll make coffee. You're going to tell me what's happening with the farm, and I'm going to tell you what I know about what your grandfather was thinking in 1976, because I think you need to hear both things before you decide how to move. Nathan sat. What Gus told him over the next 2 hours filled in the parts of the story that the repair journal had left out. In the spring of 1976, a development company from Des Moines had approached several farmers in Shelby County about an easement deal related to a proposed irrigation consortium. The company wanted to sink wells and establish a shared water extraction system across multiple properties, and they wanted the participating farmers to sign agreements that would, as Gus explained it, effectively subordinate the farmers' individual water access rights to the consortium's operational needs. Walter had looked at the agreement and understood immediately what it actually said, beneath what it appeared to say, which was that signing it would mean the consortium could pump water from the underlying aquifer without limit and without compensation to the surface rights holders. Walter had not signed. He had instead driven to the county seat and filed for a formal certificate of water rights under Iowa code, establishing his priority claim to the aquifer beneath his specific acreage before the consortium could establish any competing claim. Then he had taken the certificate to Gus and had it sealed in a pipe, and had mounted that pipe under the secondary seat bracket of his Massey Ferguson 275. Because, as he had told Gus at the time, the machine was the one thing on the farm he was certain would survive him. The consortium had dissolved 2 years later. The development company had gone bankrupt. The whole episode had been forgotten by everyone in the county except the 2 men who had been sitting in this welding shop on a June morning in 1976 and had decided together that some things were worth preserving. Nathan drove back to Shelby County in the late afternoon with the lawyer's name in his pocket and the certificate back in its cylinder on the seat beside him, and a clearer picture in his head of what his grandfather had understood 43 years ago that no one else had seen coming. He called the lawyer that evening. The lawyer's name was Everett Cross. He was 67 years old and had handled Iowa agricultural water rights cases for 3 decades out of an office in Ames. Nathan explained the situation in plain terms. The water rights certificate, the notice of acceleration from Vanguard, the 90-day window, the fact that Vanguard had already begun construction of a deep well irrigation system on the 3 farms they had acquired in the county farms that sat above the same aquifer identified in certificate number 7. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Everett Cross said, "How long have they been operating those wells?" Nathan said he did not know exactly. He said his neighbor, Ada Holden, had told him 3 weeks ago that her well had been dropping. He said he had checked his own well levels and found them down 4 feet from the previous November. Cross said, "I need you to get me the exact installation date of those wells. County permit records will have it, and I need a copy of that certificate on my desk by Friday." Nathan said, What does it mean if they've been pumping from the aquifer without the certificate holder's authorization? Cross said, it means that every day they have been doing it. They have been trespassing on a documented water right under Iowa, Code 462A. It means compensatory damages. It means the longer they have been doing it, the larger the number gets. He paused. Then he said, Mr. Briggs, your grandfather was a careful man. Yes, sir, Nathan said. He was. The county permit records showed that Vanguard's contractor had pulled drilling permits on the 14th of October. Nathan pulled the records himself at the county recorder's office on a Friday morning, standing at the counter in his work coat while the clerk made copies. The permits listed 3 well sites on 3 separate parcels, all acquired by Vanguard Agro, LLC, within the past 14 months. The drilling had begun on October 21st. Nathan counted the days on the calendar on the wall of the recorder's office. 51 days. He sent the copies to Everett Cross that afternoon along with a photograph of the certificate. Cross called him back inside 2 hours. The numbers Cross said were preliminary but significant. Under Iowa trespass law for water rights violations, the compensatory standard was calculated on the basis of the market value of the extracted resource, plus a statutory multiplier for willful extraction without authorization. The daily extraction volume from 3 commercial agricultural wells operating at full capacity was approximately 140,000 gallons per day. Market value of aquifer water in Shelby County for agricultural use was currently $8 per 1,000 gallons. The statutory multiplier for willful trespass was 3. Nathan did not do the math while Cross was talking. He waited until the call ended, and then he sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and worked it out in the margins of the farm's operating budget worksheet. 140,000 gallons per day. $8 per 1,000 gallons. That was $1,120 per day in base value. Multiplied by 3 for willful trespass was $3,360 per day. Multiplied by 51 days was $171,360. He read the number twice. Then he wrote it again more carefully to make sure he had not made an arithmetic error. He had not. He called Cross back. Cross said, that is the preliminary basis. The actual figure in litigation would depend on judicial interpretation and the precise measurement of extraction volumes which we would obtain through discovery. But yes, that is the approximate territory. Nathan looked out the kitchen window at the south field. The winter light was flat and gray, and the stubble stood in even rows across the dark earth. He said, they have 41 days left on my notice of acceleration. Cross said, I know. Nathan said, so the number is still going up. Cross said, every day. Hargrove came back on a Wednesday afternoon in the 5th week. He came alone this time without Derek Slade, or the man with the briefcase. He drove the Escalade up the gravel drive and knocked on the front door, and Nathan opened it and stood there in the doorway without inviting him in. Hargrove looked different from the last time Nathan had seen him at the auction. He was wearing the same kind of coat, but something in the way he was wearing it had changed. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and looked at Nathan with an expression that was trying to be collegial and was not entirely succeeding. I want to make you a better offer, Hargrove said. Vanguard is prepared to go to 1.5. That covers your debt, gives you operating capital for a transition, and gets you out from under a situation that is not going to get better. Nathan looked at him for a moment. He said, who told you about the water table assessment? Hargrove blinked. He said, we do our own analysis. Nathan said, your own analysis. With the drone survey you ran in October. Hargrove said, standard practice for acquisitions of this scale. Nathan said, and what did your analysis show about the aquifer under this property? Hargrove's expression shifted slightly. Not much, just enough for a man who was paying attention to notice. He said that the aquifer data was part of Vanguard's proprietary assessment and that he was not in a position to discuss the specifics. Nathan said, "I'll think about the offer." Hargrove said he hoped Nathan would think quickly given the timeline. He said it in the measured tone of a man who believed he was holding every useful card in the deck. He walked back to the Escalade and Nathan watched him go and said nothing until the truck reached the county road and turned south toward Harlan. Then Nathan went inside and called Everett Cross and told him what Hargrove had said. Cross said he doesn't know about the certificate. Nathan said, "No, he doesn't." Cross said, "Good. Don't tell him." Ada Holden came over that evening. She was 68 years old and had lived on the property that adjoined the Briggs farm to the north for 40 years. Her husband Earl had died in 2011, and she had kept the farm running since then, with the help of her son, who drove in from Carroll on weekends. She was a small woman with white hair and the particular directness of someone who has been through enough that they no longer see the point of approaching things sideways. She came to the back door, which was how people who knew the farm well came, and Nathan made her coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table. She said her well was down 6 feet now from this time last year. She said 2 other neighbors to the south, the Caulfield operation, and old Pete Weston had both mentioned the same thing. She said she had called the county extension office and they had told her aquifer levels fluctuated seasonally and that she should monitor it. Nathan said, "Ada, did you know my grandfather filed a water rights certificate in 1976? She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at him. She said, "I knew he did something. Earl was there when he signed it. Earl witnessed it." Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. He said Earl witnessed the certificate. She said Walter asked him to come to the county office with him. Said he needed a witness who understood what he was signing. Earl never told me exactly what it said. He said it was Walter's business and Walter would tell whoever needed to know, when whoever needed to know it. She paused. She said, "Is that why those wells of theirs are running so hard?" Nathan said, "I think they bought land and drilled wells without knowing there was a prior claim on the water." Ada looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Earl would have liked to see this." Nathan said, "I'm going to need you to be willing to make a statement about what Earl told you. Not to Vanguard. To a lawyer in Ames named Everett Cross." She said, "You tell me when and where and I will be there." The problem that arrived in the 6th week was not Vanguard. It was the weather and the East Field and the kind of compounding bad luck that a farm in trouble does not have the margin to absorb. A hard freeze came through on a Thursday night, early even for December in Iowa, and it found a weak point in the irrigation line on the East Field that Nathan had been meaning to fix since October, and had not gotten to because October had been the month of the funeral and the notice of acceleration and everything that came after. The line cracked at a joint 30 feet from the pump house and ran water into the field for 6 hours before Nathan heard it. And by the time he shut it down, the low corner of the East Field had a sheet of ice over it that had to be broken up by hand before it damaged the soil structure underneath. He spent 2 days on that. 2 days he had not planned for working in temperatures that dropped to 12 degrees at night, chipping ice and rerouting the line, and doing the kind of physical work that leaves a man too tired in the evening to think straight. Cole called on the 2nd day, and Nathan answered from the field with his hands so cold he could barely hold the phone. Cole said, "I heard Vanguard went up to 1.5. Nathan said, "How did you hear that?" Cole said, "Hargrove called me. He has my number from the estate correspondence. He said you didn't give him an answer." Nathan said I didn't. Cole's voice was careful the way it got when he was trying not to say what he was actually thinking. He said, "Nathan, $1.5 million. After the debt is cleared, that's almost 1.4. That is not nothing. That is a real amount of money. You could start over somewhere with that. Nathan was standing in the east field with ice chips on his coat and his breath fogging in the cold. He looked out across the field toward the tree line along the creek to the south. The same tree line his grandfather had looked at from this same spot for 50 years. He said, "I'm not selling." Cole said, "Why not?" "Give me a reason that is not about sentiment." Nathan said, "Because Grandpa hid something in that machine that I found. And what he hid means the farm is not actually in the position we think it's in. That's why." There was a silence. Cole said, "What did he hide?" Nathan said, "I'll explain it when I can explain it properly, not over the phone." Cole said, "Nathan, if there is something that affects the legal situation, you need to tell the estate attorney, and you need to tell him now." Nathan said, "I have an agricultural attorney in Ames handling it. His name is Everett Cross. You can call him if you want. He'll tell you what he can tell you at this stage." Another silence. Longer. Cole said, "You already have a lawyer." Nathan said, "Yes." Cole said, "When did you get a lawyer?" Nathan said, "When I needed one." He could hear his brother processing this from 400 miles away, the specific silence of someone recalibrating every assumption they had been operating on. Cole said, quietly, "What is it? What did Grandpa hide?" Nathan said, "A water rights certificate from 1976. Priority claim on the aquifer under this property, which is the same aquifer Vanguard has been pumping from for 51 days without authorization." The silence on Cole's end was the longest one yet. Then Cole said in a voice that Nathan had not heard from his brother since they were children, "How much?" Nathan told him the preliminary number. He did not soften it or frame it. He just said the number. Cole did not say anything for long enough that Nathan looked at the phone to make sure the call was still connected. Then Cole said, "Grandpa put a water rights document inside the tractor." Nathan said, "In a sealed steel pipe under the secondary seat bracket. He had it welded shut by the same man whose name is on the certificate as witness. In June of 1976, Cole said. He knew someone was going to need it." Nathan said, "I think he knew the land was always going to need protecting. He just didn't know from what." The drone came back in the 7th week. Nathan saw it from the machine shed, where he was doing the final reassembly work on the Massey Ferguson, the engine back together, and running the hydraulics, resealed the electrical system, rewired with a new harness he had sourced from a parts dealer in Nebraska. He heard the drone before he saw it, the specific high whine of a commercial survey unit, and he stepped out of the shed and watched it move along the eastern fence line at about 80 feet. It was not over Vanguard's property. It was over his. He took photographs with his phone. He checked the timestamp. He noted the direction of travel and the altitude, which he estimated from the size of the unit against the fence posts he knew the height of. He sent the photographs to Everett Cross with a message that said, "Vanguard is conducting aerial survey of my property without authorization. Please advise." Cross called within the hour. He said the aerial survey, if conducted without a signed easement from Nathan, represented an additional civil claim and potentially a criminal trespass depending on the altitude and intent. He said Nathan should continue documenting any and all activity and should not confront anyone directly. Nathan said, "They're looking for something." Cross said, "They're trying to understand why you haven't taken the offer." Nathan said, "They think there's something they missed." Cross said, "Their own AI assessment flagged this property as low-yield, non-strategic land, which is why they priced it at 1.2 initially. The drone survey is them trying to reconcile why a kid in financial trouble is refusing $1.5 million for a farm that their own software says isn't worth the trouble. Nathan said, because their software doesn't know about the water. Cross said, correct. Their system measures surface indicators and historical yield data. It cannot detect a documented prior water claim because that claim is not in any digital database that their software accesses. The certificate exists only on paper at the state level, in a file that would require a specific manual record search to find. Nathan said, and they haven't done that search. Cross said, if they had done that search, they would not be offering you $1.5 million. They would be doing something very different entirely. 2 days before the deadline, Vanguard's irrigation system on the adjacent parcel failed. Nathan heard about it from Ada Holden, who heard the machinery at night and looked out her window and called Nathan at 10 in the evening to say that there were lights and trucks on the Kellerman parcel, which was one of the 3 Vanguard acquisitions, and that something seemed to have gone wrong. Nathan drove to the county road and parked and watched from a distance. There were 3 service trucks and a portable generator, and men in reflective vests moving around the wellhead with the specific urgency of people dealing with something that was not supposed to be happening. He learned later through the county extension office's daily report, which he had been monitoring closely, that the aquifer draw in that section had created a subsidence issue. The extraction rate from 3 commercial wells running simultaneously had lowered the water table faster than the surrounding substrate could accommodate, and the resulting pressure differential had caused a minor collapse in the soil layer, 8 feet below the surface, on the Kellerman parcel, damaging the well casing and the pump assembly. Repair costs, according to what eventually surfaced in county permit filings, ran to $240,000. Hargrove had not publicly commented. Nathan took the news the way he took most things, quietly and without visible reaction. He went back to the shed and continued working on the tractor. The engine was running well by this point. The deep, steady thrum of the Perkins diesel that he had rebuilt from a frozen block of corroded metal over the past 9 weeks, settling into a rhythm that filled the shed and pressed out through the gaps in the walls into the winter night. He had ordered new tires. He had rebuilt the clutch. The hydraulics worked smoothly through their full range of motion, which he tested by raising and lowering the 3-point hitch 40 times while watching the cylinders for any sign of weeping seals. He had sourced the paint from an auto parts store in Harlan Massey Ferguson red, mixed from a code he had found in the repair journal, in an entry from 1983, when his grandfather had touched up the hood after a branch had caught it in the woodlot. 2 coats of primer, 3 coats of color. 1 coat of clear applied in the driveway on a cold morning when the wind was calm enough to let him work. The smell of the paint mixed with the smell of the bare winter fields and the diesel from the running engine and became something that Nathan could not name, but that he knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Cole drove back from Chicago the day before the deadline. He did not call ahead this time. He pulled into the farm drive at 7 in the evening, and Nathan heard the BMW on the gravel and came out of the shed and stood in the yard. Cole got out and stood by his car and looked at the Massey Ferguson 275 parked next to the shed in the last light of the day. Fully restored, fully painted, the Massey Ferguson triple triangle decal, bright on the hood. The new tires clean against the frozen ground. Cole stood there for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You actually did it." Nathan said, "Engine runs clean. Hydraulics are solid. New tires, new harness, rebuilt clutch." Cole walked over slowly and stood next to the machine. He put his hand on the hood the way Nathan had seen him do things carefully, when he did not trust himself to do them carelessly. He looked at the tractor for a long moment. Then he looked at Nathan. He said, "I talked to Everett Cross." Nathan said, I know. He told me you called. Cole said he told me the preliminary figure could be over $3 million if they contest, and it goes to litigation. He said they'll almost certainly settle before that. Nathan said, probably. Cole said Nathan. Grandpa hid a document in a tractor for 43 years in case someone needed it. Nathan said, in case we needed it. Cole looked at the tractor again. He said quietly, I told you to sell it for scrap. Nathan said, I know you did. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I was wrong. Nathan did not say anything back to that. There was not anything that needed to be said back to it. He put his hand on the hood of the machine beside his brother's hand, and they stood there in the last light of the Iowa winter evening, while the farm spread out around them in the cold and the dark in every direction, all 400 acres of it holding its breath. Tomorrow, Hargrove was coming with the paperwork. Nathan had something to show him. The night before the deadline did not feel like the night before anything in particular. That was the strange part. Nathan had expected something different from it, some quality of the air or the silence that would mark it as different from the other nights he had spent on this farm in the past 10 weeks. But it was just a night, cold and clear and dark in the way Iowa nights in December were dark completely, and without apology, the stars hard and bright above the fields and the temperature dropping towards single digits by the time he finished his final checks on the tractor and closed the shed door. He went inside and heated soup on the stove and ate standing at the counter. The certificate cylinder sat on the kitchen table where he had put it 3 weeks ago. The repair journal sat beside it. He looked at both of them while he ate and thought about his grandfather driving that Massey Ferguson down the county road in the spring of 1974, with the engine running like a top and 60 acres of scrub waiting to be turned into something worth keeping. He washed his bowl and set it in the rack. He went to bed at 9:30 and slept without difficulty, which surprised him, and did not dream, which did not. He was up at 4:15. He made coffee and drank it at the table with the certificate and the journal in front of him. Outside the kitchen window, the farm was completely dark, the yard light casting a pale circle on the frozen ground, the fields beyond it invisible. He could hear nothing through the walls, except the wind moving across the open ground to the west, the low, steady sound of it like breathing. He dressed in his work clothes, flannel shirt, canvas vest, the insulated work pants he wore when the temperature dropped below 10, his boots, his grandfather's canvas coat that still hung on the hook by the back door, a coat 2 sizes too large that Nathan had been wearing since he was 16 years old and that he had never considered replacing with anything else. He went to the shed. The Massey Ferguson 275 stood in the center of the space where he had positioned it the evening before, under the trouble light, the red paint catching the yellow glow and throwing it back. He walked around it once the way he had walked around it every morning for the past 3 weeks, checking the tires, checking for any seepage from the hydraulic fittings, looking at the things that could quietly go wrong overnight, and that a man who was paying attention would catch before they became problems. Everything was as he had left it. He climbed up into the seat. The new vinyl creaked under his weight the way new vinyl does, stiff and clean, not yet broken in. His boots found the clutch and brake pedals. His hands found the wheel. He sat there for a moment in the cold shed with the trouble light above him and the darkness pressing against the gaps in the walls. And he thought about his grandfather sitting in this same configuration on a morning in March of 1974. Engine not yet started, hands on the wheel, thinking whatever a man thinks in the moment before he commits to something, he cannot take back. He reached down and turned the key, 1 click. The dash lights came on. Oil pressure warning, glow plug indicator, charging light. All red, all waiting the same as they had been on the first morning he had started it. except that now they felt familiar instead of uncertain. He held the glow plug switch for 20 seconds. The journal had specified 20 seconds in cold weather. He had followed that instruction every time he started the engine because his grandfather had written it down, and his grandfather had not written things down carelessly. He turned the key the rest of the way. The starter pulled the engine through 2 full revolutions before it caught, and when it caught cleanly. Without the coughing hesitation of the first morning, the Perkins diesel finding its rhythm almost immediately and settling into that low, steady thrum that filled the shed and pressed through the walls and out into the dark Iowa morning. The exhaust stack sent a brief cloud of vapor into the cold air above the roofline. The temperature gauge began its slow climb toward operating range. Nathan sat on the machine and let it warm up, and did not move for a long time. He was still sitting there when he heard Cole's footsteps on the shed floor behind him. His brother had slept in the spare room and apparently had not slept much because he looked like a man who had spent the night thinking rather than resting. He was wearing his good coat over a sweater, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and he handed one up to Nathan without saying anything, which was perhaps the most useful thing Cole had done since arriving. Nathan took the coffee. They did not speak. Cole stood beside the tractor with his own cup, and they both listened to the engine run in the cold shed, while the sky outside the gaps in the walls went from black to the deep blue-gray of pre-dawn, and then from blue-gray to the pale flat light of a December morning in Iowa that never quite became bright, but simply became less dark. At 6:45, Nathan said, "They'll be here at 7. Cole said, "I know." Nathan said, "I want you to stay on the porch unless I ask you to come down." Cole looked at him. He said, "Nathan." Nathan said, "This is mine to handle." A pause. Cole looked at the tractor and then at his brother. He said, "All right." Nathan finished his coffee and handed the cup back to Cole and climbed down from the seat. He went to the workbench and picked up the certificate cylinder and put it in the inside pocket of the canvas coat. He picked up the repair journal and put it in the outer pocket. He put on his work gloves. Then he climbed back up onto the seat of the Massey Ferguson 275 and sat there with the engine running and waited. He heard the trucks before he saw them. The sound of heavy vehicles on the county road carried clearly in the cold morning air, and then the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, and then the sweep of headlights across the shed wall as the first vehicle turned in. 3 sets of lights. He had expected 3 vehicles. Nathan pulled the tractor out of the shed. He drove it slowly at the pace a man uses when he is not in a hurry and does not intend to give the impression that he is out through the shed door and into the yard. The morning air hit him full in the face, sharp and clean and cold enough to make his eyes water. The tractor's exhaust rose in a pale column above him. The engine ran without complaint, steady and deliberate, the way it had run for 18 years under his grandfather's hands, and the way it would run now under his. He stopped in the center of the yard between the shed and the house and left the engine running. 3 black SUVs had parked in a line along the side of the gravel drive. Hargrove got out of the first one. He was wearing the charcoal wool coat and the Italian leather shoes, and he was carrying a document folder under his arm. Derek Slade got out of the second vehicle along with a man Nathan did not recognize who was carrying a briefcase and who had the look of someone brought along specifically to hold things. 2 other men in dark coats got out of the third vehicle and stood beside it without approaching. Hargrove looked at the tractor. He looked at Nathan on the tractor. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a minor recalibration, the look of a man who had prepared for several possible scenarios and was now determining which one he was in. He walked across the yard toward Nathan. His shoes were wrong for frozen gravel, and he picked his way with the careful steps of a man who refused to acknowledge that his footwear was inadequate for the environment he had chosen to enter. He stopped 10 feet from the tractor. He looked up at Nathan and said, "Mr. Briggs, today is the 90th day. I have the settlement paperwork. The offer remains at $1.5 million, which I think we both know is a generous position, given the outstanding debt and the current market." Nathan said nothing. "Hargrove said I'd like to resolve this morning, quickly and cleanly. That's good for both of us." Nathan reached into the inside pocket of the canvas coat and took out the certificate cylinder. He held it for a moment. Then he climbed down from the tractor, leaving the engine running, and walked the 10 feet to where Hargrove was standing and held the cylinder out. Hargrove looked at it. He did not take it immediately. He said, "What is that?" Nathan said, "Open it." Hargrove took the cylinder with the expression of a man accepting something he had not expected to be offered. He looked at the cut end. He looked at Nathan. Then he turned to Slade and handed it to him, which was the move of a man who preferred to have other people touch things first. Slade took the cylinder. He reached inside and drew out the rolled plastic sleeve and opened it, and unrolled the document onto the hood of the nearest SUV, smoothing the edges with his palms. He read for a moment. Then he read for longer. The yard was very quiet except for the diesel engine behind Nathan. The sound of it filled the cold air, steadily, not loud, but present the way a heartbeat is present. Slade looked up at Hargrove. He said something in a low voice that Nathan could not hear but that Hargrove could, and he watched Hargrove's face while Slade was speaking. Hargrove's face did not do anything dramatic. It did not go pale or red. It went still, which was in some ways worse, the particular stillness of a man who has just understood something he cannot ununderstand. The man with the briefcase had come over and was reading over Slade's shoulder. He straightened up and looked at Hargrove and said in a voice that had lost the professional certainty it had arrived with, "This is a priority water rights certificate under 462A. It predates any of our acquisition agreements in this county by 4 decades. Hargrove said nothing. Slade said, "Gideon, if this is what it appears to be, every well we're operating in this section is in violation." Still nothing from Hargrove. Slade said, "The extraction that's already occurred, the subsidence on the Kellerman parcel, all of it falls under willful trespass if the certificate holder can demonstrate prior knowledge by us," Hargrove said quietly. "How long have you had this?" Nathan said. "Since the 4th week. It was in the machine." Hargrove looked at the tractor. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has misjudged fundamentally. Not with anger, but with a kind of unwilling recalibration. He said, "Your grandfather." Nathan said, "In 1976. He put it in a sealed pipe and mounted it under the seat bracket. He thought the machine would last longer than any filing cabinet he owned." "He was not wrong," Slade said. He said it almost to himself without looking up from the document. The man with the briefcase had opened it and was on his phone speaking quietly. Nathan did not try to hear what he was saying. The 2 men who had gotten out of the 3rd vehicle had moved closer and were standing near the SUVs without any evident purpose, which was what men do when a situation has moved past the scenario they were briefed on. Then something else happened. Nathan heard the sound of a truck on the county road, not approaching fast, just moving. Then another. Then a third. He looked toward the road without turning his body, keeping his attention on Hargrove, and in his peripheral vision he saw pickups pulling over onto the gravel shoulder of the county road along the fence line. Not pulling in, just stopping, parking. 3 of them, then a 4th, then 2 more further down. He recognized Tommy Hale's truck, Ada Holden's green Ford, the blue Silverado that belonged to Pete Weston, who had farmed the section to the south for 40 years, and who had mentioned his well levels dropping at the co-op in November. Men sitting in their trucks on the county road in the cold December morning, engines running. Not getting out, not saying anything, just there. Hargrove noticed them too. He looked at the road, and then back at Nathan, and then at the tractor behind Nathan, and something in his posture changed in a way that was small but was not nothing. Slade said, "Gideon, we need to call Des Moines." Hargrove said, "I know." Slade said, "We need to do it now, before this goes any further." Hargrove looked at Nathan. He said in a tone Nathan had not heard from him before, "How much do you want?" Nathan said, "Everett Cross handles those conversations. You have his number." Hargrove said, "Who?" Nathan said, "My attorney, in Ames. He's been waiting for your call for 2 weeks." Something crossed Hargrove's face that was not quite any one thing Nathan could name. It was the look of a man in the middle of understanding how far back the preparation for this moment actually went. He said, "You had a lawyer before we made the second offer." Nathan said, "Before the first one." Hargrove said nothing to that. He picked up the settlement folder he had brought and held it for a moment, and then handed it to Slade without opening it. He looked at the certificate document still spread on the hood of the SUV, held flat by the cold morning air. And he looked at the tractor. And he looked at Nathan in the canvas coat with the work gloves and the worn boots. He said, "Your grandfather was a thorough man." Nathan said he was. Hargrove turned and walked back to the first SUV. He got in. The other men got into their vehicles. The man with the briefcase was still on his phone as he got into the second vehicle and closed the door. The 3 black SUVs reversed along the gravel drive and turned onto the county road and drove south toward Harlan without any additional conversation. The trucks on the shoulder of the road did not move. Nathan stood in the yard and watched the Escalades disappear around the bend in the county road, and then looked at the pickups still parked along the fence line. He could see faces behind the windshields. He raised one hand, not a wave exactly, just an acknowledgement, and one by one the trucks started their engines and pulled back onto the road and went their separate ways without anyone having gotten out or said a word. Cole had come down from the porch. He was standing in the yard 5 feet behind Nathan's hands in his coat pockets. Nathan turned around and his brother was standing there with an expression Nathan had not seen on him in 20 years since they were kids. And something had happened that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet. Cole said, "That's it." Nathan said, "That's the beginning of it. Cross takes it from here." Cole looked at the road where the SUVs had gone. He said, "They're going to fight it." Nathan said, "Probably. For a while." Cole said, "And then..." Nathan said, "And then they're going to settle. Because fighting it means discovery, and discovery means they have to explain 51 days of extraction from an aquifer that belongs to this farm. Cross says the exposure on that alone is enough to make settlement the only rational outcome." Cole said quietly, "What's the number going to be?" Nathan said, "I don't know exactly." Cross said somewhere between 2 and 3 million after his fees. Enough to clear the debt and have something left. Cole was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the tractor still running in the center of the yard, the exhaust rising straight up in the windless, cold morning air. He said, "Nathan, I told you to sell it for scrap." Nathan said, "You mentioned that." Cole said, "I was wrong." Nathan said, "I know." Cole said, "I drove up here with a folder of spreadsheets to explain to you why you were making an emotional decision instead of a rational one. And you had already talked to a lawyer. You had already found the document. You were already 3 moves ahead of me." Nathan said, "I was following the journal." Cole said, "You were doing what Grandpa told you to do." Nathan said, "Same thing." They stood in the yard together for a while without speaking. The engine ran. The morning light, such as it was, lay flat and pale across the frozen fields. Somewhere to the east a crow called once, and then stopped. Cole said, "I keep thinking about him in 1976, 43 years old. Going to Gus's shop with a rolled-up document and asking him to seal it in a pipe and put it in the machine. Nathan said he didn't know when it would be needed. He just knew it might be," Cole said, "and he trusted that someone would find it." Nathan said he trusted that someone would fix the machine. Cole looked at him. Nathan looked back at his brother and let the sentence sit there in the cold air between them. It took Vanguard 11 days to call Everett Cross. Cross told Nathan afterward that the call had come from a senior vice president in Des Moines, not from Hargrove, which meant Hargrove had been removed from the matter entirely, which was information that Cross offered without editorial comment, and which Nathan received the same way. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Nathan was not part of it directly. He spoke to Cross every few days, and Cross told him what he needed to know. And Nathan asked the questions he needed to ask, and did not ask the ones that were not his to ask. He ran the farm during those 3 weeks. He fed the cattle. He checked the fence line. He serviced the equipment. He ran the books in the evenings at the kitchen table with the certificate cylinder on the counter behind him, and the repair journal on the shelf above the desk. Ada Holden's well recovered in the second week after Vanguard shut down the extraction operation on the adjacent parcels. She called Nathan to tell him, and he could hear something in her voice that was not quite relief, because relief implies that things might have gone the other way, and she had never. He thought seriously believed they would. She said Earl would have liked to see this settled right. Nathan said he helped settle it. His name is on the certificate. She said, "I know it is. I've thought about that." She paused and then said, "You know what he told me the night he came home from signing that document with your grandfather? He said Walter Briggs was the most careful man he had ever known. He said most men plan for next season. Walter planned for after he was gone." Nathan did not say anything to that for a moment. Then he said, "He was right." She said Earl was right about most things. He was just quiet about it. Nathan said, "Sounds familiar." The settlement was reached on a Thursday afternoon in January. Cross called Nathan while he was in the equipment shed doing a secondary check on the hydraulic lines of the second machine, the one he had brought home from the auction, which he was now working on as a separate project with no particular deadline attached to it. Just work. The kind of work that made sense to do when you had the time and the tools and the inclination. Cross said, "They've agreed to $2.4 million, payment within 60 days. In exchange, we grant them a limited non-exclusive easement on water access from the southern portion of the aquifer, only with documented annual volume limits and quarterly monitoring rights for Shelby County. The easement is separable and can be revoked with 30 days' notice if they violate the volume limits," Nathan said, "and the debt," Cross said, "cleared entirely. That was non-negotiable from our side, and they knew it." Nathan said, "And the certificate." Cross said, "Remains with the land, in perpetuity." That was also non-negotiable, and they accepted it on day 4 of discussions, which told me everything I needed to know about the strength of our position. Nathan sat down on the floor of the equipment shed, with his back against the wheel of the second Massey Ferguson. The trouble light was on above him. He could smell old oil and cold metal and the particular dusty dryness of a shed in winter. He said, "Cross, what would have happened if I hadn't found it?" Cross said they would have foreclosed. They would have acquired 400 acres of extremely water-rich farmland for approximately 50 cents on the dollar, and they would have sold it within 5 years for 3 times what they paid. And the certificate would have sat in that pipe under the seat bracket until someone eventually scrapped the machine, which might have been never. or might have been next spring. Nathan said, "My grandfather knew someone might never find it." Cross said, "I think he knew that was possible, yes. But I also think he believed that the person who was meant to find it would find it." Nathan said, "Because they'd be in the shed working on the machine." Cross said, "That's my read." Nathan said, "Thank you, Cross." "For everything." Cross said, "Thank your grandfather. I just read the document. He wrote it." Cole drove back up from Chicago the weekend after the settlement was signed. He did not bring the laptop bag or the expandable folder. He arrived on a Saturday morning with nothing but a small overnight bag and stood in the kitchen while Nathan made coffee, and neither of them said much for the first hour. They ate breakfast together at the table where their grandfather had eaten breakfast every day for 50 years. And then Cole asked if he could help with anything on the farm that day. And Nathan said yes and put him to work. They spent the afternoon doing the kind of work that farms in January require, and that has no particular drama attached to it. Checking the south fence line for loose staples, replacing a gate latch that had been stiff since October, clearing the drain at the low corner of the east field that still collected standing water. Whenever the temperature went above freezing, Cole worked without complaining and without offering opinions and without checking his phone except once, which Nathan considered a significant achievement. At the end of the afternoon, they walked back to the shed and stood in the open doorway in the last flat light of the January day and looked at both Massey Fergusons. The restored one and the one still in process, the one Nathan had bought at the auction with most of his remaining money. On the same day, Hargrove had watched him do it and said something about headstones. Cole said, "Are you going to restore the second one too?" Nathan said, "Already started. Different configuration. Four-wheel drive option on this one. Better suited for the north field." Cole looked at the machine for a moment. He said, "You know what I keep thinking about? What Hargrove said at the auction, about headstones and futures." Nathan said, "I remember." Cole said, "He was talking about the tractor. He thought buying the tractor was the headstone. He didn't know the tractor was the opposite of that." Nathan said, "He was looking at the rust. He wasn't looking at what was under it." Cole said, "That's the whole story, isn't it?" Nathan said, "Pretty much." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to be more involved in the farm. I'm not saying I'm moving back. I'm not in a position to do that right now. But I want to be involved in decisions, real decisions, not just coming up here with spreadsheets to tell you what the numbers say." Nathan looked at his brother. He said, "You'd have to learn some things." Cole said, "I know. I'm asking you to teach me." Nathan said, "Okay." Cole said, "That's it." "Okay," Nathan said. "That's it. Start with the hydraulic system on this one. It's been sitting for 25 years and I haven't gotten to the fittings yet. I'll walk you through what to look for." Cole looked at the machine. He said, "Right now," Nathan said, "trouble light's already on." He picked up the light and moved it closer to the second machine, and Cole came into the shed, and the door closed behind them both, and the light fell yellow and warm across the metal, and the tools, and the two brothers standing side by side in the shed that their grandfather had built with his own hands in 1968. And that was still standing. Nathan drove the restored Massey Ferguson out to the south field on a Sunday morning in late January, the morning after a light snow that had dusted the fields in white and then stopped before it amounted to anything. The sky was the pale, clear blue that follows a light snow in winter, the kind of sky that is more light than color, and the fields stretched out in every direction under it. In their winter stillness, the dark soil showing through the white in the low corners where the wind had swept it. He drove slowly. Not because the machine could not go faster, but because there was no reason to hurry, and because the particular feeling of that engine under him, and that wheel in his hands, and those fields in every direction, was something he did not want to rush through. He stopped at the far end of the south field, the same spot where his grandfather had turned 2 acres on the afternoon of the day he brought the Ferguson home in March of 1974, when the ground was soft enough to work, and the light lasted long enough to make 2 acres feel like a beginning. Nathan sat on the machine for a while with the engine running and his hands on the wheel. The snow on the field was undisturbed. The tree line along the creek to the south stood dark against the pale sky. The old windmill at the top of the rise to the west turned slowly in the light morning wind, its blades catching the winter light and throwing it back in long, slow arcs. He thought about his grandfather driving the Ferguson off Patterson's lot and going straight to this field without stopping at the house first. He thought about the June morning in 1976 when Walter had taken a rolled document to a welding shop in Davenport and asked a man named Gus to seal it in a pipe, and had driven home and mounted it in a place where it would be found only by someone who was paying the right kind of attention. He thought about the last entry in the journal, not the mechanical notes about the head gasket, the other part, the part written for someone who would read it later. He reached into the outer pocket of the canvas coat and took out the repair journal. He had been carrying it for 10 weeks. He opened it to the last page and read the last entry one more time in the morning light, the handwriting of a man who had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote it. Don't give up on this land. It will test you. The bank will test you. The weather will test you. Your own family will test you. But this land is worth fighting for because it is not just dirt. It is everything we put into it. Every sunrise we worked through. Every frost we survived. If you are reading this in the shed, you are probably thinking about fixing her up. Good. That means you are the right one. Nathan closed the journal and put it back in his pocket. He put the tractor in gear and dropped the plow and drove the first furrow of the new year across the south field, the turned earth rising dark and clean behind him against the white of the snow, the diesel engine working in its low, steady register, the smell of cold-turned soil rising into the winter air and mixing with the exhaust and becoming something that was entirely its own thing, something that had no name but that Nathan recognized the way a man recognizes a voice he has not heard in a long time. He drove those rows until the field was done. Then he parked the tractor at the end of the last row and climbed down and put his hand on the warm hood and felt the engine ticking underneath as it began to cool the small sounds of metal settling after work. And he stood there in the January light with the farm around him in every direction. 400 acres of black Iowa soil that had been in the Briggs family for 58 years and that would stay there. And he did not say anything out loud, because there was nothing that needed to be said out loud. Some things are understood between a man and the land he stands on. Some things are understood between a man and the machine that helped him keep it. Those understandings do not require words. They require only the willingness to show up in the shed with a trouble light and a bucket of tools, and the patience to do the work that needs doing for as long as it takes until the engine catches and the field opens and the furrows run straight and dark across the earth, the way they always have and the way they always will. The repair journal sits on the desk now next to the window that looks out over the south field. The certificate is filed with Cross's office in Ames, and a certified copy is in the safe at the county recorder's office, and a second certified copy is in the steel cylinder resealed mounted back under the secondary seat bracket of the 1974 Massey Ferguson 275, where Walter Briggs put it in the summer of 1976, because Nathan decided that was where it belonged. Some things should stay where they were put by the person who understood best why they needed to be there. The farm is still standing. The engine runs every week, and the south field when Nathan drives across it in the blue light of early morning still smells like what it has always been and what it will always be. Not just dirt, but everything that has been put into it, every hand that has worked it, every season. It has survived every generation that chose to stay.